A dying chimney, a frozen cabin, and a lonely cowboy riding into the storm. But why was he willing to risk everything for a woman he barely knew? Snow hammered against the cabin walls as Caleb Morgan forced open the frozen door, his boots sinking into the white ground. Inside, a widow and her young son lay silent beside an empty stove, with the last ember fading in the cold. He carried them toward his warm fire, but the reason he opened his door would become the question everyone in Red Hollow wanted answered. Stay with us to discover the truth behind this frontier love story. The first heavy snow of the winter came early to Red Hollow Valley. It arrived before the cattle had fully adjusted to the cold, before the last wagon from town had made its final trip across the mountain road, and before many families had stored enough firewood for the long months ahead. By the second night, the wind had turned fierce. It pushed against the small cabin on the northern edge of the valley, rattling the wooden shutters and sending thin streams of snow through the gaps in the old roof. Inside, Evelyn Carter sat beside a dying stove, holding a small piece of wood that was barely enough to keep a flame alive for another hour. Across the room, her 8-year-old son Samuel lay beneath 2 worn blankets. His cheeks had lost their color, his breathing was quiet. Too quiet. Evelyn pulled the blanket higher around him and looked toward the stove. 3 days earlier, she still had enough wood stacked beside the cabin to believe she could manage. She had measured every piece carefully. 1 bundle for cooking, 1 for the night, 1 for emergencies. But the storm had come harder than anyone expected. The road back to town disappeared beneath snowdrifts. The small creek near the cabin froze solid. The roof began leaking near the back corner, and every morning she woke to find another patch of frost creeping across the floorboards. She had survived difficult years before. She had worked fields under a summer sun until her hands cracked. She had carried heavy sacks of grain when her husband was too tired to stand after long days on the road. She knew hardship, but this was different. This was a quiet kind of danger, the kind that sat outside the door and waited. Evelyn reached over and touched Samuel's forehead. "We're going to be all right," she whispered. She said it softly, not because she was certain, because her son needed to hear it. Outside, the Wyoming wind swallowed every sound. No wagon's wheels, no passing riders, no neighbors calling from the road, only the storm. And somewhere beyond the white hills, a cowboy named Caleb Morgan was watching the same storm. Caleb owned a small ranch on the western slope of Red Hollow Valley. It was not the biggest ranch in the territory. It did not have the largest herd or the finest house, but every fence post, every barn beam, and every stone around the fireplace had been placed by his own hands. At 35 years old, Caleb had learned to depend on very little. A good horse, a sharp knife, a reliable rifle, a warm stove, and his own judgment. Most mornings, before sunrise, he walked the fence lines with a coffee cup in one hand and a worn leather coat pulled tight around his shoulders. He checked for broken posts, loose gates, and cattle that had wandered too close to the mountain pass. That morning, the snow reached halfway up his horse's legs. The animal moved slowly, breathing clouds into the frozen air. Caleb pulled his hat lower and looked across the valley. His eyes stopped on a small cabin sitting alone on the distant ridge. The Carter place. He knew the cabin belonged to Evelyn and her boy. He did not know them well. He had seen her twice in town, once at the general store, where she carefully counted coins before buying flour and lamp oil. Another time outside that feed shop, carrying a sack over one shoulder, while Samuel followed behind, holding a small wooden toy horse. Caleb remembered thinking the boy looked too serious for his age. He also remembered something else, the cabin chimney. Every morning there had been smoke until today. Caleb stopped his horse. The wind moved across the valley, but the chimney remained silent. No gray trail rising into the sky, no sign of a fire. His hand tightened around the reins. A person living alone in the mountains could survive many things, but not a winter storm without heat. Caleb turned his horse toward the cabin. The ride was slow. The snow fought every step. More than once, the horse sank deep enough that Caleb had to dismount and lead him through the worst parts of the trail. The half-mile distance felt like 5. By the time he reached the cabin, snow covered his coat and beard. He knocked. No answer. "Mrs. Carter?" Only the wind replied. He knocked again, harder. Still nothing. Caleb stepped back and looked at the door. A thin layer of ice covered the handle. His jaw tightened. He pushed his shoulder against the frozen wood. The door gave way. Inside, the cabin was colder than outside. The stove was dark. The fire was gone. For a moment, Caleb saw nothing but shadows. Then his eyes adjusted. Near the small bed against the wall, he saw Evelyn holding Samuel close beneath the blankets. Both were barely moving. Caleb crossed the room quickly. "Mrs. Carter." Her eyes opened slowly. She looked confused, then afraid. Not of him, of what she had become. "I'm fine," she whispered. It was the first thing she said. Caleb looked at the empty wood box beside the stove, then at the broken roof above them, then back at her. He did not argue. He simply removed his coat and placed it around Samuel. "You're not fine." His voice was calm, not harsh, just certain. Evelyn tried to sit up. "We can manage." Caleb looked at her for a moment. A woman freezing in a cabin with a child in her arms was still trying to convince him she did not need help. Something about that stayed with him. He had known pride before. He carried his own. Too much of it sometimes. Without saying another word, Caleb lifted Samuel carefully and wrapped him in a blanket. Evelyn tried to stand. Her legs nearly failed. Caleb reached out. She hesitated before taking his hand, only for a second. But he noticed, not because she was weak, because she was someone who had spent a long time refusing to need anyone. The journey back was slow. Caleb rode while Evelyn sat in front of him, holding Samuel close. The storm covered their tracks almost as quickly as they made them. When they finally reached Caleb's ranch, a warm light came through the kitchen window. The same house that had been quiet for years, the same house where only one person usually sat by the fire. Caleb carried Samuel inside first. He placed him near the stove and added more wood to the flames. Then he turned back to Evelyn. She stood in the doorway, looking at the room, at the table, at the empty chair, at the simple life of a man who had built everything he needed, except someone to share it with. Caleb walked to the fireplace and added another log. The flames grew brighter. Then he looked at her. "I've got a warm fire," he said quietly. A pause. "You can stay as long as you need." Evelyn looked away, not because she did not hear him, because accepting those words felt harder than surviving the storm. Hours later, after Samuel was sleeping safely in a warm room, Evelyn sat awake near the fire. She watched Caleb repair a broken strap on his work glove. He never asked where she came from, never asked how much money she had, never asked why a woman and her child had ended up alone in a mountain cabin. He simply helped, and somehow that made it harder to understand. The next morning, when the snow still blocked the mountain road, Evelyn stood near the door with her coat in her hands. She was ready to leave, even if the road was dangerous, even if the cold waited outside, because staying felt like owing something, and Evelyn Carter had spent her whole life making sure she owed no one. Caleb looked at her. Then he looked toward the frozen trail outside. Neither of them spoke, but both understood. The storm outside was not the only thing keeping her there. The mountain road was buried beneath snow, and even the strongest horse in Red Hollow Valley would struggle to make the journey back to Evelyn Carter's cabin. Caleb Morgan knew that. Evelyn knew it too. Neither of them wanted to say it out loud. That first morning at Caleb's ranch, sunlight barely reached through the frost-covered windows. The storm had weakened, but the world outside remained covered in white. The fences disappeared under snowdrifts. The trail toward town was nothing more than a narrow line between frozen hills. Caleb stood near the stove, pouring coffee into an old tin cup. He placed another cup on the table without looking at Evelyn. She noticed, not because he made a show of kindness, because he didn't. That was what made it difficult. Most people who helped expected something in return. A promise, gratitude, a reminder that you owed them. Caleb simply left the cup there and walked outside to check the barn. Evelyn stared at the coffee for a long moment before taking it. It was warm, simple, a small thing, but after days of cold, it felt like more than that. Samuel sat beside her, wrapped in a thick wool blanket that Caleb had found in a storage chest. "Does he always talk this little?" the boy asked quietly. Evelyn almost smiled. "I think he does." Samuel looked toward the door where Caleb had disappeared. "He seems nice." Evelyn looked down at her cup. She did not answer. Nice was a word people used easily, but she had learned that kindness and dependence were not the same thing. By noon, Caleb was already outside. He repaired a broken section of fence near the eastern pasture, his coat covered with snow and his gloves dark from work. He moved with the patience of someone who had spent years fixing things instead of replacing them. Evelyn watched from the window. The ranch was larger than she expected. There were 2 barns, a small workshop, a chicken coop, and a long wooden porch that wrapped around the front of the house. It was a good place, but it felt strangely quiet. Too quiet. There were no voices coming from the kitchen, no music, no signs that children had ever played there. Only the sound of boots on wooden floors and the occasional crack of firewood. Later that afternoon, Evelyn found herself standing in the kitchen. She opened the cupboard. There was enough flour, enough beans, enough dried meat. Everything was arranged neatly, but there was only one bowl sitting beside the stove, one plate, one spoon, one person living a life built for one person. That evening, Caleb returned, carrying a bundle of firewood. Samuel ran toward him, not quickly, not like he knew him well, just enough to ask a question. "Can I help tomorrow?" Caleb stopped. The boy looked up at him seriously. "With what?" "The horses." For a moment, Caleb said nothing. Then he nodded. "Start by learning how to brush one properly." Samuel smiled. It was small, but Evelyn saw it, and she saw something else. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, Caleb smiled too. Only for a second. But it was there. A few days passed. The storm held the valley in place. The 3 of them settled into a strange routine. Caleb woke before sunrise. He fed the animals, checked the fences, returned with cold hands and snow on his boots. Evelyn cooked meals, not because anyone asked her, because she needed to contribute. She repaired a torn curtain near the kitchen window. She organized the pantry. She washed Caleb's work shirts and hung them near the stove to dry. Every time he tried to thank her, she simply nodded and changed the subject. One evening, Caleb found his old coat hanging near the door. The torn sleeve had been carefully repaired. The stitching was not perfect, but it was strong. He ran his fingers over it. "You didn't have to do this." Evelyn looked up from the table where she was sorting beans. "I know." The answer surprised him. She lowered her eyes back to her work. "I wanted to." Caleb looked at her for a moment. Then he placed the coat on the chair. "Thank you." It was only 2 words, but from Caleb Morgan, they carried weight. That night, Evelyn woke because of a sound coming from the hallway. A voice, quiet, almost impossible to hear. She stepped out of her room. Caleb was standing near the old closed door at the end of the hall. His hand rested against the wooden frame. He was not aware she was there. "Mary," he whispered. Evelyn stopped. She had heard the name before, not from him. From the silence of the house, from the way one room remained untouched. Caleb opened the door slightly. Inside was a room frozen in time, a folded dress on a chair, a small wooden box, a vase with dried flowers, that had lost their color years ago. Nothing had moved. Nothing had changed. Evelyn stepped back quietly before he noticed her. The next morning, she found him outside repairing a wagon wheel. The air was cold. The sky was clear for the first time in days. She stood near the porch. "Caleb." He looked up. She hesitated. Not because she was afraid, because she understood that some doors were harder to open than others. "That room," she said. His hands stopped moving. For a moment, only the sound of the hammer resting against the wagon filled the air. "That room belongs to my past." Evelyn looked toward the mountains. "Or does your past belong to that room?" Caleb said nothing. She did not push. After a while, he returned to his work, and Evelyn walked back inside. She knew then. The man behind the wooden door was not cold. He was carrying something heavy, something he had never learned how to put down. That evening, Samuel sat near the fire while Caleb showed him how to carve a small wooden horse. The boy's hands were unsteady, the shape was uneven, but when he finished, he held it proudly. Caleb looked at the carving, then at Samuel. "Like a horse." Samuel grinned. Evelyn watched from across the room. For the first time in a long while, the ranch did not feel empty, but outside, beyond the valley, the world was beginning to notice. And in Red Hollow, people always noticed when something changed. The next morning, a wagon stopped at Caleb Morgan's gate. A neighbor stepped down from the seat. Her eyes moved from the ranch house to the woman standing beside the porch. Then to Samuel. She said nothing, but she did not need to. By sundown, the whole valley would know. Evelyn Carter was living under Caleb Morgan's roof, and the quiet mountain ranch was no longer quiet. By the time the snow began to melt along the lower trails of Red Hollow Valley, people had already started talking. At first, it was only whispers, a few words exchanged near the general store, a glance held a little too long outside the feed barn, a conversation that stopped the moment Evelyn walked by. She noticed. Of course she noticed. A woman who had spent years learning how to survive alone learned quickly when people were measuring her. But she said nothing. Every morning she helped Samuel prepare for the day. She packed his small lunch, fixed the loose button on his coat, and watched him walk beside Caleb toward the barn. The sight was something she never expected. Samuel, who had barely spoken after losing his father, now asked questions about horses, fences, and cattle. Caleb answered everyone, sometimes with only a few words, sometimes with a quiet smile. And every time Evelyn saw that, she felt something she was not ready to name. The ranch was becoming the home. And that frightened her, because homes were things people could lose. One afternoon, while Caleb was repairing a broken gate near the south pasture, Henry Morgan arrived on horseback. His brother dismounted slowly, looking toward the house before speaking. "Town is talking." Caleb kept working. They always talk. Henry looked at him, not like this. The hammer stopped. For a moment, the only sound was the wind moving through the dry grass. "William Grayson has been asking questions," Henry continued, "about Evelyn's land." Caleb looked up. "Her land," Henry nodded. "He knows she inherited that small parcel from her husband. He also knows she doesn't have many people standing behind her." Caleb's expression hardened. "She can handle herself." Henry studied him. "That's what worries me." Caleb looked away, because he knew what his brother meant. Helping someone was one thing, caring about them was another, and caring gave people something to lose. Across the valley, William Grayson sat inside his large ranch office, looking over a stack of papers beside a polished wooden desk. His ranch stretched farther than any other in Red Hollow. More cattle, more land, more influence. He had built his reputation on knowing exactly when someone was vulnerable. Evelyn Carter's land was small, but it sat beside a valuable water path, and William knew opportunity when he saw it. A few days later, Evelyn received a letter. The paper was folded neatly, the handwriting was formal. Inside was a notice regarding unpaid debts connected to her late husband's old business arrangements. She read it twice, then a third time. The room felt smaller. Caleb found her sitting at the kitchen table. The letter rested beside an untouched cup of coffee. "What happened?" Evelyn folded the paper. "Nothing I can't handle." Caleb looked at her, the same words, the same stubborn certainty. The same woman who had nearly frozen in a cabin rather than admit she needed help. "Evelyn," she looked up. "I said I can handle it." There was no anger in his voice, only concern. And somehow that made it harder. "I don't want to be another problem you have to solve," she said quietly. Caleb stood still. "You're not a problem." The words came quickly, almost before he could stop them. Evelyn looked at him. For a moment, neither moved. Then she looked away. The next morning, Caleb rode into town. Red Hollow's main street was busy. A wagon stopped near the blacksmith. Children ran between buildings. Men stood outside the general store drinking coffee and discussing the spring cattle routes. Caleb walked into the county office where William Grayson was already waiting. The papers were spread across the desk. William leaned back. "You're involved now?" Caleb looked at the documents. "No." William smiled slightly. "That's not what it looks like." Caleb's eyes lifted. "I'm here because someone is trying to take advantage of a woman who has already lost enough." The room went quiet. William tapped the papers. "This is business." Caleb nodded. "Then handle it fairly." William leaned forward. "And what happens when the town starts wondering why Caleb Morgan suddenly cares so much about one woman?" Caleb did not answer, because he knew the question was not about business. It was about reputation. That evening, word spread quickly. People gathered outside the small meeting hall near the church, not because anyone had invited them, because people in small towns rarely missed a chance to decide what they thought about someone else. Evelyn stood beside Caleb, not behind him. Beside him. William stepped forward holding the documents. "This woman has financial troubles tied to her property." His voice remained calm. "That land may soon be lost." Evelyn took a breath. Before she could respond, Caleb reached into his coat and removed a small leather notebook. He placed it on the table. William's expression changed. "What is that?" Caleb opened it. Records. He turned the pages. Receipts. Dates. Payments. "I covered part of the outstanding debt after the storm." Evelyn turned toward him. Her face changed. "You did what?" Caleb looked at her. "I knew the bank would move quickly." Her voice became quieter. "You paid it without telling me?" "I was trying to help." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. Evelyn stepped closer. "You saved my life, Caleb." Her voice trembled, but she stayed steady. "Don't take away my chance to save myself." The words struck him harder than anger would have, because she was right. He had spent years believing protecting someone meant carrying their burden for them. But Evelyn was not asking for someone to carry her. She was asking for someone to stand beside her. Caleb lowered his eyes. "I'm sorry." It was a simple apology. But from him, it meant everything. The meeting ended without a decision. William left frustrated. The town left with more questions than answers, and Evelyn walked back toward the ranch in silence. 2 days later, she packed her belongings. Not because she hated Caleb, because she cared enough not to let him lose everything because of her. Caleb stood near the front porch as she loaded her bag. The morning was clear. The mountains were finally free of snow. "You don't have to leave," he said. Evelyn looked at the ranch, at the barn, at the window where Samuel had laughed for the first time in years. Then she looked back at Caleb. "I do." He said nothing, because he understood. Some battles had to be fought alone. Evelyn climbed onto the wagon. Caleb stepped aside. He let her go. But when the wagon disappeared down the valley road, the ranch felt different. The same walls, the same furniture, the same fireplace, but the warmth was gone. And Caleb Morgan finally understood something he had spent years avoiding. A house could have a fire and still feel cold. Caleb Morgan learned that in the weeks after Evelyn left. The ranch did not change. The same wooden floors creaked beneath his boots every morning. The same iron stove warmed the kitchen. The same coffee pot sat beside the window before sunrise. But something was missing. For years, Caleb had believed silence was something a man could get used to. He had been wrong. Silence was different when it was chosen, and different again when it was all that remained. Every morning, he still reached for 3 cups before stopping himself. One for him, one for Samuel, one for Evelyn. Then he would put the extra cups away, slowly, like admitting a mistake. Across the valley, Evelyn Carter was learning a different kind of loneliness. Her small ranch was quiet, not empty. She had work, plenty of it. The fence needed repairs. The roof over the storage shed needed new boards. The small field behind the cabin needed clearing before planting season. She woke before dawn, tied her hair back, pulled on her work boots, and carried on, because that was what she had always done. She survived. But some mornings, when the wind moved through the valley, and she heard the distant sound of horses, she found herself looking toward the road, waiting for someone who was not coming. Samuel noticed. Children often noticed what adults tried to hide. One evening, while Evelyn fixed a torn shirt near the lamp, he asked quietly, "Do you think Mr. Morgan misses us?" The needle stopped in her hand. She looked down at the fabric. "I don't know." Samuel looked toward the window. "I think he does," Evelyn smiled faintly. "Why?" The boy shrugged. "Because he looked happier when we were there." She did not answer. Because sometimes children saw things adults were too afraid to admit. Meanwhile, William Grayson continued moving forward. He had not forgotten about Evelyn's land. The small property sat near a spring that became valuable during dry months. It was not a large piece of land, but William knew the importance of controlling every resource around Red Hollow. One afternoon, Evelyn received another letter, this time from the county office, a hearing date, a dispute over ownership and debt. She placed the paper beside the stove and stared at it. The room was quiet. Too quiet. For the first time since leaving Caleb's ranch, she allowed herself to admit something. She did not want to go through it alone. Not because she was incapable, because carrying every burden alone had become heavier than she expected. That evening, Abigail Turner came by with a basket of fresh bread and a jar of preserved peaches. The older woman stepped inside and looked around the small cabin. "You've been working yourself into the ground." Evelyn gave a small smile. "I'm managing." Abigail placed the basket on the table. "I know you are." She paused. Then she looked directly at her. "But a woman can survive alone." The room became still. Abigail continued softly. "Surviving ain't the same as living." Evelyn looked away. Those words stayed with her long after Abigail left. A few days later, Evelyn returned to Caleb's ranch, not to ask for help, not to ask him to solve anything. She only needed to speak with him. But when she arrived, the ranch looked different. The gate hung slightly open. The barn door was still unlocked. The porch was covered with dust. Caleb had always kept everything in order. Now the place looked like a man who was taking care of things because he had to, not because he wanted to. She found him near the workshop repairing a saddle strap. He stopped when he saw her. Neither spoke at first. The space between them felt larger than the distance she had traveled. Evelyn, Caleb, just their names, nothing more. Sometimes 2 people could say everything without saying much at all. She noticed the tiredness in his face. He noticed the worry she tried to hide. "I heard about the hearing," he said. She looked at him. "How?" "Henry told me." A small silence followed. Then Caleb reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a folded piece of paper. Evelyn recognized it immediately. The debt documents. Her expression changed. "I told you, I know," he interrupted gently. "I know what you told me." He handed the paper back. "I was wrong." Evelyn looked at him. Those words mattered, because Caleb Morgan was not a man who admitted mistakes easily. "I thought protecting someone meant carrying the weight for them," he said. His eyes moved toward the mountains. "I forgot they might want to carry their own." Evelyn lowered her gaze. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Caleb turned toward the house. "There's something you should see." She followed him inside. He walked down the hallway toward the closed wooden door, the one she had seen before, the one he had kept untouched. This time he opened it. Inside was the same room, the same chair, the same folded dress, the same memories. But something had changed. On the small table near the window was a wool scarf. Evelyn recognized it. "Your wife's?" Caleb nodded. "She made it years ago." He picked it up carefully. "She always said winter was easier when people stopped trying to face it alone." Evelyn touched the edge of the scarf. There was a small folded paper tucked inside. Caleb looked surprised. He had never seen it before. Slowly, he opened it. The handwriting was old, simple, a message left behind. Caleb read silently. Then his expression changed. Evelyn did not ask. She waited. After a long moment, he handed the paper to her. Only a few words were written. "Don't let grief convince you that loneliness is loyalty." Evelyn read it twice. Then she looked at Caleb, the man who had spent years protecting a memory because he was afraid of losing it. The man who had opened his door during a storm. The man who had saved her life but forgotten that his own needed saving too. She folded the paper carefully. "Caleb." He looked at her. "You don't need someone to take care of you." A pause. "You need someone who reminds you that you're still alive." Outside, the wind moved through the trees, but inside that old ranch house, something that had been closed for years finally began to open. Evelyn returned home that evening, but she did not pack because she was leaving. She packed because she was going back, not to be rescued, not because she needed a roof, not because she owed Caleb Morgan anything. She was returning because she had finally understood. A person could stand alone and still choose to stand beside someone else. The next morning, Evelyn Carter turned her wagon toward Red Hollow Valley, and this time, she was not going back to the man who saved her. She was going back to the man she loved. The road from Evelyn Carter's cabin to Red Hollow Valley was still rough from the winter thaw. Mud covered the wagon wheels. Small streams crossed the trail where snow had melted from the mountain slopes. But Evelyn kept moving. Samuel sat beside her, holding the reins when the road was flat enough. The boy looked ahead with a quiet excitement he tried not to show. "Are we going back to Mr. Morgan's ranch?" he asked. Evelyn looked toward the mountains. "Yes," Samuel smiled. "Good." She glanced at him. "Why?" The boy looked down at his boots. "Because it felt like home." The answer stayed with her, because she had spent so much time trying to prove she could live without needing anyone. She had forgotten that choosing a home was not the same as depending on one. When Evelyn arrived at Caleb's ranch, the late afternoon sun was falling behind the hills. Caleb was near the barn, repairing a fence post. He heard the wagon before he saw it. For a moment, he did not move. Then he looked up. And there she was. Evelyn stepped down from the wagon. Neither of them rushed forward, neither needed to. Some moments carried their own weight. "I came back," she said. Caleb looked at her quietly. "I see that." A small smile almost appeared on his face. Almost. Evelyn looked toward the ranch house. "I'm not here because I need saving." Caleb nodded. "I know. I'm not here because I owe you anything. I know that too. She looked back at him. Then why do you think I'm here? For a moment, Caleb had no answer. The man who could face a winter storm without hesitation suddenly seemed unsure what to say. Finally, he stepped closer. Because you chose to come. Evelyn smiled softly. That's right. And for the first time, they stood beside each other without one person needing to rescue the other. But before they could find peace, William Grayson made his final move. The hearing was scheduled 3 days later at the county office in Red Hollow. The room was small. Wooden benches lined the walls. Farmers, ranchers, and townspeople gathered to hear the dispute over Evelyn's land. William arrived wearing a clean, dark coat. Carrying a folder of documents, he looked confident. He had built his whole life on the belief that people without power eventually gave up. Evelyn stood beside Caleb, not behind him, not waiting for him to speak, beside him. When William presented his argument, he spoke about debts, property lines, and old agreements. Everything sounded official. Everything sounded reasonable. Until Evelyn stood. I would like to say something. The room became quiet. William looked surprised. He had expected Caleb, not her. Evelyn walked toward the table. Her hands were steady. I know what these papers say. She placed her own documents down. I know about the debt. I know about the claims against my property. She looked around the room. But I also know something else. She paused. My husband worked that land. I worked that land. I rebuilt that place after losing him. And I will not walk away from it because someone believes I am easier to move than a man would be. No anger, no shouting, just certainty. Caleb watched her from the back of the room, and he understood. This was the woman he had rescued from the storm, but she was no longer the woman lying helpless in that frozen cabin. She had found her own voice. William shifted his attention toward Caleb. You'd risk your name for her? The room went still. Caleb looked around. At the people who had whispered. At the people who had judged. Then at Evelyn, the woman who had brought warmth back into his empty house. His answer came quietly. A name that can't survive kindness isn't worth keeping. No one spoke, because there was nothing to argue with. The hearing continued for another hour. Documents were reviewed, witnesses were questioned, and slowly, the truth became clear. Evelyn had not been looking for someone to save her. She had been fighting to keep what was already hers. When the decision came, William Grayson walked out without the confidence he had entered with. The people of Red Hollow watched him leave, and for the first time many of them looked at Evelyn differently, not as a woman who needed protection, but as someone who had earned respect. Spring moved deeper into the valley. The grass returned, the cattle wandered farther across the open fields, and one morning, beneath the shade of a tall cottonwood tree near Caleb's ranch, a small gathering stood together. No grand celebration, no expensive decorations, just people who mattered. Samuel held the rings carefully in both hands. Abigail Turner wiped away a tear before anyone noticed. Henry Morgan stood beside his brother with a quiet smile. Caleb looked at Evelyn as she walked toward him, the same woman he had found during a storm. The same woman who had taught him that loneliness was not the same as strength. After they exchanged their vows, Caleb held her hand. The first night you came here, he said softly, you needed my fire. Evelyn looked at him. He glanced toward the ranch house behind them. But somehow, you became the reason I wanted to keep it burning. Years later, people in Red Hollow still told the story. They remembered the winter when a cowboy saw a cabin with no smoke rising from the chimney. They remembered the woman who arrived with nothing but courage and a child beside her. And they remembered how a cold mountain ranch became a home, not because of the walls, not because of the land, but because two people who had both lost so much finally found somewhere they belonged. And maybe that is the part of Caleb and Evelyn's story that stays with us the longest. Because if you had been standing in that cold cabin, with the wind pressing against the walls and someone you loved depending on you, would you have had the courage to accept a hand reaching out? Or if you were Caleb, carrying years of silence behind a locked door, would you have been brave enough to let someone bring warmth back into your life? Sometimes the hardest thing a person can do is not surviving the storm. It is believing that after the storm, there can still be something worth living for. Evelyn found a place where she did not have to prove her strength every moment. Caleb found that honoring the past did not mean refusing the future, and together they discovered that love is not about saving someone from their struggles. It is about standing beside them while they find their own way forward. If this story touched your heart, share in the comments where you're watching from, and tell us what moment stayed with you the most. Thank you for spending this time with us. If you enjoy stories of courage, healing, and unforgettable journeys from the old frontier, consider subscribing. There are many more heartfelt stories waiting for you in the chapters ahead.